So, let's start our afternoon session on the post-war era, the internationalization of justice. My name is Eyal Gross. I apologize. I've been teaching in the morning, so I apologize I've missed the discussions there, but I hope to be able to spend some of the rest of the time with you. We have only two of the panelists because Rotem Giladi has been under the weather. So we have two, so I will introduce them one by one. First one is James Loeffler. The title of his paper is How Do You Say Genocide in Yiddish? Reflection on the Forgetting of Jewish Human Rights History. And James Loeffler is Associate Professor of History at the University of Virginia, and he's also the Robert Savitt Fellow at the Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And he has written about a few books. One is called The Most Musical Nation, Jews and Culture in Late Russian Empire, already published. And the second one is forthcoming and is going to be called Rooted Cosmopolitans, Human Rights and Jewish Politics in the 20th Century. He's also the co-editor with Moria Paz of a book called The Law of Strangers, Critical Perspective on Jewish Lawyering and International Legal Thought, also forthcoming. So that's very prolific, and many other articles and that I will not list. And he's also affiliated with the Jewish Music Research Center at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. So we see music and human rights coming together. So looking forward to hear the paper. Please.
Thank you, Eyal, and thank you to our organizers and everyone who's already begun our conference. To echo what Willie said, it's rich on the paper and it's rich in live. So I've already profited a lot from it. So you heard my title, and I want to begin right away, and again, because his name comes up a lot in these types of contexts, with Raphael Lemkin. So on January 18th, 1951, the American Jewish Congress held a luncheon at the Pierre Hotel in New York City. For those of you who've ever seen it, it's Shishi, nice hotel, to honor, quote, the father of the Genocide Convention for his achievement. The event took place just after the UN Convention on Genocide.
I was told that you forgot. This microphones are critical. It's being recorded. Posterity.
I'll assume.
You're going to go viral, Jim.
Yeah, here we go. Okay.
You don't need to start.
Actually, there'll be a paper
I'm not starting.
here. That's like you're talking about Lemkin. There'll be a paper here about 30 years on this talk.
I'll say if we only had the beginning. So this event takes place right after the UN Convention on Genocide had gone legal, had crossed the threshold number of state ratifications. So at this event, Lemkin graciously thanked his hosts for their support of the convention. Then he launched into a tirade. And he said, quote, his baby was less than a week old. It had only been less than a week since it had been, gone official. But it was already in danger of being killed. He blamed another organization, the American Jewish Committee, as Willie mentioned, one of the alphabet soup of NGOs in the Jewish world at this time. And he also blamed an unnamed group of UN international lawyers. They were engaged in a stealth campaign to, quote, sabotage the Genocide Convention. And here's the main big quote for the paper that sets up everything we're going to talk about. Quote, they have classified genocide as a part of human rights, which is a dangerous confusion because the Human Rights Project deals with discrimination, which might happen also in democratic countries, while genocide deals only with mass destruction, annihilation, and extermination, which happens only and mostly under totalitarian regimes. Politically, such a confusion is dynamite and spells a doom for the Genocide Convention. Human rights are identical with civil rights, and civil rights spells filibuster. End quote. So, American Jewish liberals and émigré European international lawyers, which I would read as, i.e., Jewish lawyers working at the UN, of whom there were many, were not the only targets in this speech. He went on from there to also blast the North Korean regime and the Chinese for their takeover of Tibet. This is 1951. The communists were preparing, quote, a genocide in Asia. This was no less than, quote, a mammoth planned totalitarian effort to eliminate all potential democratic influence from Asia. The slogan, Asia for the Asiatics, he warned, carried in itself the seed and implication of genocide. So there's a lot in this quote from Lemkin and this anecdote. And what I want to do today is highlight three features of it that leap out at me and that speak to three themes that we have covered or are going to cover in this conference. The first is the most obvious, the disaggregation of the Holocaust and human rights. It could not be clearer than in this 1951 moment that human rights were not born as a response to the Holocaust, nor were human rights synonymous with anti-atrocity law or genocide law. Despite this oft-repeated myth, and I think it's fair to call it a myth, especially among lawyers and activists, and even some historians, Lemkin's remarks remind us that human rights and anti-genocide were distinct projects. Now, one could say more about this, and happily we have great scholarship, beginning with our keynote speaker, Sam Moyne, Marcos Duranti, on this subject of how the Holocaust is and isn't deployed in talking about human rights and conceiving of them at this moment. But to go on. This wasn't to say, and I'm not proposing, that there was no relationship between human rights and, let's call it, anti-genocide or atrocity law. Both owe their origins to, surprise, surprise, the pre-Holocaust phenomenon of minority rights, about which we've heard. But they grew in parallel as two distinct, occasionally complementary, often conflicting projects. Their later conjoining is significant, to be sure, but it's distracting. And its distraction is the theme I'm particularly interested in here. We need to dismantle this linkage between human rights and the Holocaust because it turns human rights history again and again into a morality tale. And hence it blinds us to the role of politics, specifically Jewish politics, in the story of human rights. Likewise, and equally for those of us working specifically on Jewish history, it obscures the relevance of human rights to the story of modern Jewish politics. So this brings me to observation number 2 about Lemkin's speech. If you imagine with me him on the dais at this swanky hotel, thanking his supporters at the World Jewish Congress, the American Jewish Congress, and then turning to attack his opponents, this is an image, I think, that runs against a trope involving Lemkin. We've been taught by Samantha Power and others to remember Lemkin as a heroic one-man crusader, a lone Polish Jewish Holocaust survivor, a forgotten man whose funeral famously was attended by only 7 people. He was thus a man with no politics and no true friends, only a burning passion for international justice. And I think this fits very clearly against a narrative of Lemkin as a true cosmopolitan Jew. That is to say, a man with no true homeland or politics. He is, in the words, to paraphrase Michael Ignatieff, a Jew who built himself a home in international law because he had no other. The reality could not be more different. And again, I'm not the first person to propose this, but I think it still hasn't really infiltrated our image of Lemkin. He was an advice columnist. He was the legal advice columnist, like our chair here, I guess, in the interwar Polish Yiddish press. And I don't know if anybody else here has read it, but I mean, he wrote columns advising the Jews of Poland in Yiddish about what the new laws meant, what they meant for the kahila, what they meant for citizenship, and so on and so forth. He was a Jewish nationalist, which kind is still open to some debate. He translated Bialik from Hebrew into Polish. He was a hero to young Polish Zionists who saw him as an openly Jewish national figure because he was determined to voice and demonstrate and perform his Jewishness in the Polish bar, even as he faced anti-Semitic attacks, and also because, in the words of one commentator, because he didn't convert. Even in the 40s and 50s, as he operated, and I wouldn't dispute this, as a very solitary figure, he worked with a network, and the network involved the World Jewish Congress to pursue his agenda. All this, I would say, is forgotten today. Now, we could tell a lot of other similar stories about Jewish crusaders in the history of human rights. But what I'm trying to push against is this image that these are therefore deracinated Jews or rootless cosmopolitans who, because of their estrangement from the majority culture or their refugee status, naturally gravitate towards a certain type of internationalist politics and human rights. I think this has to be challenged for the sake of human rights and the sake of history. Otherwise, we can't really explain how these things connect. And it also means, and this is something that I think this conference is helping us to do because of the particular constellation of people we have here, to talk about how we project our contemporary sensibilities, wishes, and anxieties backwards into the past. So this brings me to observation number 3. It's striking to read or to hear Lemkin speak in 1951 about his distinction between totalitarian and democratic countries. The former are where atrocities occur. They require more urgent attention. Human rights are necessary and good, he seems to say to us, but they distract us from the greater crimes that threaten mass violence on vulnerable human populations. So this call for a distinction between an open and closed societies is one that we hear today, actually, right, in discussing Israel and human rights. It's been advanced specifically in the context of Human Rights Watch's own internal debates about its coverage and its reporting on Israel, and whether one can make this distinction or whether one used to make this distinction or not. That's a claim that often comes, I would say, from the right, and not only the right. So is Lemkin's related argument that human rights, as a somewhat of a feel-good abstraction, conceal and distract from other greater dangers and injustices. And this is a claim that we now increasingly hear also on the left, that human rights mask power relations. Mark Mazauer's name was mentioned earlier today, an historian who's argued that it really has to be seen against what was not given to certain peoples after World War II. So then Lemkin is eerily prophetic about many of the issues we confront as scholars and practitioners of human rights, except in one regard. For it seems to me that Lemkin's deepest critique and his most substantial legacy for us today has been forgotten. And I mean by this his insistence on thinking about international justice in terms of groups, not individuals. And here you can see what I'm talking about relates to some of the earlier wonderful papers we've heard. For what Lemkin, as well as his allies at the World Jewish Congress, represented was a specific Jewish tradition of political reflection on the meaning of minorityness, of groupness, and of nationhood in the realm of international law. That legacy has all but vanished, but perhaps it's a genealogy worthy of reflection and might help us as we contemplate something of an impasse today between Jewish politics and human rights. So briefly, to explain what I'm talking about, I'm going to rehearse the arguments in the book that is in process and reaching completion. And then I'll turn back briefly at the end to talk about what we might gain by trying to recover some of this legacy. So the book I'm writing is a dual history of Jewish politics and human rights across the 20th century. And there are 5 people in this story it's built around, who include some of the names we've heard today: Jacob Robinson, Hirsch Lauterpacht, Morris Perlsweig, also affiliated with the World Jewish Congress, Jacob Blaustein, and Peter Benenson. Between them, they represent groups as diverse as the World Jewish Congress, the Jewish Agency, the American Jewish Committee, the Israeli Misrad Chutz, and Amnesty International. In a nutshell, my thesis is that the Jewish origins of human rights, which is not the only origins, but the Jewish genealogy, do not lie in religious ethics or cosmopolitan moral responses to anti-Semitism or to the Holocaust, nor is this really a chapter in the history of Jewish liberalism. I think it's tempting to see this all as one step away from a familiar narrative of a Jewish quest for emancipation, for citizenship, to a world of universal rights. But I think the real drama and the real source of this thinking among nationalists and anti-nationalists is the interplay between modern Jewish nationalism and internationalism. So where does the story begin? In my telling, we could point backwards further into the 19th century and talk about what's been called the imperialism of human rights for British British and French Jewish elites. We can also trace minorities' protection through the late 19th century Balkans and Eastern Europe. But I think the starting point is 1905. That is the year that we have the Russian Revolution, which is triggering migrations and new thinking for Zionists and others about empire and nationhood. And that is the year that basically, I would say, before the American Jewish Congress, before World War I, you really have a political reckoning begin in the Jewish world, but in New York. Because this is the first point at which you see the appearance of two factions clashing, who will continue to clash for the next 3/4 of a century over the question of Jewish nationhood and international law. On one side stood Jewish liberal nationalists, represented by East European Zionists, the American Jewish Congress, eventually the Comité de Délégation Juive, and the World Jewish Congress. And this is a group that from 1905 onwards engaged enthusiastically with the project of minority rights and minorities protection, and turns reluctantly to human rights during World War II. This is the milieu out of which Lemkin also emerges. For his ideal of genocide, as we now know, encompasses a notion of a right to collective national and or cultural identity that shares much with the minority rights discourse of his fellow East European Zionist internationalists, as I like to call them, men such as Jacob Robinson, Morris Perlsweig, and Lauterpacht. Although we can talk about Lauterpacht. The latter trend, the other side of this 3/4 of a century-long conflict, finds expression in classic Jewish liberal anti-nationalist organizations. And this is the American Jewish Committee and its West European counterparts, the Alliance Israélite Universelle from France, Anglo-Jewish Alliance, and some other figures. These groups practiced and feared Jewish internationalism at one and the same time. And to me, they're fascinating because I really do think they practice it even as they refuse to acknowledge they're practicing it because they're scared of this, even this phrase, Jewish internationalism. This is a group that I would say reluctantly engages with minority rights and then turns enthusiastically to human rights in the 1940s as an antidote to nationalism. Specifically, they embrace the idea of an individualist, Anglo-American, constitutionalist form of human rights. Now, if I can make anything that I would say is an incisive contribution to what we've already talked about today, my point I would want to stress is that when we historicize these groups and these genealogies, the key thing, I think, is that they're co-constitutive. That is to say, they define themselves in relation to one another through this political fight that takes place in the Jewish context from 1905 onwards. They're born together as liberal nationalists and anti-nationalist liberals think together through the implications of the new international society, the new international law, and the realities of Jewish life in the early 20th century. In the conflict over how to define and press claims for Jewish rights and the rights of Jews, in New York in 1916, Paris in 1919, Geneva in the 1930s, New York in the 40s, the groups on each side of this divide used one another to think through the very ideas of minority, nation, and rights. Both saw the struggle for Jewish rights as one in which to protect vulnerable Jewish populations and at the same time to fix the proper relationship of Jews inside international law. Nothing encapsulates this better than the debates about the term minority rights. We know there was an incredible variety of ideas put under that rubric of minority rights. There was differences among individual thinkers from time to time. People who were on the same team politically disagreed about what it meant and what it should mean. It was never consistently applied or defined. Still, if we pull back, big picture, from the intricacies of all of this political back and forth, what I think we can say is there really was a 50, if not a 75-year debate in the Jewish world between those who favored minority rights and those who opposed them. And that debate in and of itself turned again on the question of those who believed or wanted or favored Jewish nationhood as a category and those who didn't. And I think if we start there, it's much easier to sketch a genealogy of human rights. We can see that both of these sides turned to internationalism and international frameworks during and after World War I. But they differ on whether these new kinds of rights and rights claims are an extension of Jewish nationalism or a repudiation of it. That rights and even minority rights could appear as both to these different groups testifies not only to the extreme ambiguity in the interwar period of all of this discourse, but also to the shared dilemma that they had being representatives of a diasporic group in a world system that was increasingly being built and rebuilt on an entrenchment of territoriality in international law and statehood as based on territory. Neither the Jewish nationalists, who I would say almost all actually wanted a Jewish nation state, nor the anti-nationalists, who opposed one, had a state to contend with or through which to press claims. So they found themselves in the same boat until 48. Now, the debate didn't end in 48. It continued. And one of the interesting things, I think, is to see how it plays out further into the 50s and 60s and beyond. I want to argue, however, in my final kind of historiographical claim here, that the key point in a changing or an end of this pattern I'm describing is not 48 and it's not 67 and it's not 75, but it's the early 60s. Because I think this is a moment in which a set of seemingly unrelated trends coalesce to change the way that all of these Jews across the world think about their own relationship to nationhood, to rights, and to law. And I'll just run through this bullet point. First, the global swastika outbreak, an outbreak of anti-Semitism all over the world in 1960, shook the confidence of Jewish NGOs at the UN about what human rights could and could not do to protect Jews from a resurgence of anti-Semitism. And this is an interesting thing that has attracted some attention from a couple different scholars of late. Second, early 60s, the American Civil Rights Act, and this ties in, I think, with what Willie is talking about, of 64, brings Jews formally into the category of white majority and makes Jews, as I like to call them, invisible to the American state, at home and abroad, by defining them no longer as a group or defining American racial politics in a new way in which there now actually are rights claims for groups in a certain sense, beginnings of affirmative action, but do not apply to Jews. Third, the Soviet thaw brings with it a very complicated mixture of things, including new currents of anti-Semitism and a renewed Jewish national consciousness among Soviet Jews. Fourth, 1960, the beginning of a Moroccan Jewish wave of immigration. And obviously we know a major story about something we haven't talked about, Jews in the Arab Middle East. Fifth, Peter Benenson, one of the people I'm interested in, son of two leading British Jewish Zionists, converts to Catholicism and launches Amnesty International in 1961. And finally, in the same year, in Israel, Eichmann. So all these events are the early 60s, and this is not to discount 67 or its legacies for our day, but to show that actually these are larger term trends converging to have the cumulative effect of repositioning Jews in terms of, I would say, a unidirectional focus on an emigration. And the idea is the solution to anti-Semitism and to Jewish vulnerability is emigration. And that's why from that point onwards you can see commentators in both of these camps I've described, however much some of them do continue to push for human rights, to push for law, to say publicly and often privately that there's only one human right that matters, which is the right to leave. The only question left over by 67, I would say, is where they should go. The story of the 70s, as we know, is a story of a different debate, and it's a debate about precisely that. Where should Jews go? To Israel, to America? It's a story of Jewish politics. It's not a story, of Jewish politics and human rights in the classic sense of politics. For the organizations and the political thinkers I've mentioned, all exit the human rights movement at this juncture, to be replaced by new kinds of human rights groups, Amnesty International, Helsinki, Human Rights Watch, with new implications for both human rights and Jewish politics. Equally importantly, once the Jews leave the Soviet Union or begin to leave in large numbers, there's no place left in the world where Jews are legally defined as a national minority. The drama of Jews as, quote, the oldest international people in the world, this is Dubnov's line, a diasporic nation, had ended. The fight between liberals and nationalists over minorityness and rights had ended when both sides conceded it was moot. So to conclude, where does this leave us today? Let me return to the title, How Do You Say Genocide in Yiddish? And of course there are various answers, Rasmord, Genocide, Völkermord, but the real answer is you don't, right? The question itself points to the anachronistic character of contemporary thought about the linkages between human rights and Jews. To pose it implies to rekindle the debate about the uniqueness of the Shoah and its relationship to other genocides. This is not Lemkin's legacy, I would say, as we grapple today with human rights. Instead, we do better to consider how Lemkin's way of thinking about global justice in terms of groups, minorities, and nations might enrich our own thinking. When we look at contemporary Europe, we find Jewish communities seeking new tools to defend themselves in the face of anti-Semitism. In the U.S., in very intriguing and sometimes disturbing ways, American Jews are turning to law to make new claims about group defamation and about Jewish identity and its need to protect it, even as they struggle to define their status vis-a-vis Israel and Zionist politics. Here, as we all know, the status of Arab citizens of Israel continues to raise fundamental questions, whether people want to deal with them or not, about Jewish nationhood and sovereignty. And in each of these cases, I would submit, Lemkin may have something valuable to offer us. His suggestion that beyond legal individualism, the comforting discourse of universal individual rights and similar notions, group identity and nationalism must be taken seriously in order to root out problems of international law and justice today, has to be considered. If human rights are to be salvaged as an ideal for our time, they cannot be strictly based on a binary between the supreme sovereignty of the individual and the arch fiction of the nation. So in closing, let me give the last word to Lemkin's buddy, sometimes nemesis, but someone we've heard about already today, Jacob Robinson. At a conference held here at Tel Aviv Law School, I believe 54 years ago, Robinson professed hope that minority rights would reappear in international politics writ large, and Jewish politics in particular. He asked rhetorically, quote, were minority rights an experiment that failed? Perhaps, he responded, one may use the Talmudic expression, lo ikshadara, which freely translated means a precious gift was given to a generation which proved to be insufficiently mature to weave it into the social fabric, end quote. And now we gather here 2 generations later to contemplate that precious gift. Thank you.